Welcome to Two Crime Besties. I'm Meg,
And I'm Emma.
and this is our first ever episode of Two Crime
I
Besties.
can't believe it. It's been a long time coming.
It really has, especially with technical difficulties along the way.
We're learning. Learning as we go.
Yeah.
We have had a bit of a false start today. Well, before today, haven't we?
Yes, but we are ready and raring to go today. I think we have checked every element.
Yes.
It's going to be
More than
perfection. So I'm still very nervous though.
Oh my. It's a weird thing putting yourself out there on a podcast, but it's something that both of us have wanted to do for ages. So we're very excited to get stuck into it.
Yes.
So how did we meet, Meg?
Oh, okay. So Emma and I met, oh my gosh, it was 6 years ago
Yeah.
now. Because my youngest just turned 7, and our youngest were 1 really when
They were.
our older ones were starting at 3-year-old kinder, and we met at the kinder being part of the committee together. I remember my first day meeting Emma. Well, I don't know if I'd seen you prior to this, but there was our first committee meeting, and Emma walked in and introduced herself, and within a few minutes she dropped the fuck. And it was so eloquently linked into not linked, but linked into the conversation that it was perfection. And I'm like, oh, my person.
People at that committee meeting who are like, not my person.
Well, then they're just not our persons.
Yeah. I know, we were instantly, I just always knew Meg and I would be friends. We just hit it off straight away.
Yeah.
And our kids ended up not being in the same year level going through school, but they're at the same, our eldest are at the same school and our youngest are at the same school in the same class, and they're best friends. So it's been a really lovely friendship over the last 6 years, and well, we've taken it to the next level podcasting together, haven't we?
This is definitely next level. It's a whole other level of intimacy.
Yeah. But what's our first episode about, Meg?
Yes. So, I mean, we should mention too that one thing we bonded over, other than swearing, was that we love true crime.
Absolutely.
And so we started sharing podcasts that we were listening to, and back and forth. And so, we've decided to start our first podcast on none other than the Frankston serial killer, Paul Denyer.
Yeah, we thought we live in Melbourne, and we thought we'd start off with a case that's close to home. We know these places. We don't live too far, maybe about 30 k's or so from Frankston. And when we were deciding on our first episode, I mean, this one has absolutely intrigued me since I heard about it and started listening to podcasts about it. And in particular, the one that really, really got me hooked on this case was the Vicky Petratus Case File Presents podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely have a listen, because it's a long form podcast about the Frankston murders, and it goes into so much detail. And she's an absolute expert on this case.
She's easy to listen to, isn't she?
And she's very easy to listen to. I love how measured she is in everything she says. She's a journalist by trade, but yeah, I love listening to her, and I love her. She's very matter of fact and very factual in the things that she presents. So I've been listening to that in order to prepare for today, and lots of other podcasts about the subject. So let's get into it.
So Paul Denyer is a very interesting character. So if you don't know the story, obviously, have a listen to some other podcasts, there's plenty of books out there as well, and documentaries. But basically, a bit of a quick rundown of the case. Paul Denyer grew up in a fairly normal family, one of 5 kids. Grew up around, he moved to Melbourne himself when he was about 18, moving to Frankston, in which he started early days doing some pretty odd things. So it was, fairly tracked that he was, I guess, building to something. But then in Frankston started stalking women, and unfortunately this led to the murder of 3 women. The first being Elizabeth, Stevens, followed by Debbie Freen, and then Natalie Russell.
Yeah, and this all happened in 1993, so it was in our living memory.
And in the space of 7 weeks.
Yeah.
So he murdered these 3 women. In that same 7 weeks, he also attacked another woman, Rosa Toff. So it was a pretty intense 7 weeks of him, tormenting the people of Frankston. But thankfully they did capture him in 1993, sorry.
Yeah.
And very quickly after that was sentenced and sent to jail.
Yeah. So by the end of 1993, he was in prison for
Yeah.
the crimes that he committed. I think it was
Mm.
not long before Christmas. So it would have been an absolutely terrifying time to live in Frankston.
God, yeah.
But I guess in the grand scheme of things, often there are many times where serial killers aren't caught.
Mm.
So at least
Well,
this came to
then
a
in Australia, we really don't have serial killers are not something known in Australia all that
no.
much. You can reel them off sort of, off one hand really,
Yeah.
especially now in our lifetime.
Yeah.
But yeah, in America, I think that would be very different, and in Europe, I'm guessing too. That we could probably reel off a whole lot more fairly quickly
Yeah.
in other countries. So we do live in a very safe country in that way. But yeah, he's definitely one out of the box, that's for sure,
That's it.
and
I mean,
still alive. I mean, it's that recent that he is. Yes, he's in jail, but he's still around and still, but he can make a newspaper article any day of the week. I guess.
absolutely, and he still does. I mean, he recently came up for parole, and we can get into that a little bit more later. But his name is still very much something, a name that you hear, every now and then in the media. So,
Definitely.
yeah, he's still sort of his crimes still terrify and haunt people.
I'm sure there's still plenty of people. I mean, all these people, the girls were so young when they died that were murdered by him. Their parents are still alive,
Yep.
that they're still all tormented clearly by this. This
Yeah.
is horrendous what went on for them. But then there's the ripple effect of who else was affected,
That's it.
boyfriends, children, because unfortunately, Debbie Frame did have a 12-day-old baby when she was murdered.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's only a 30-odd-year-old man himself
Mhm.
now. He'd grown up without his mum, so it's the impact is huge. Not only, and then there's the people just who lived in Frankston at the time and remember that fear of when he wasn't caught yet and not knowing who it was. So,
Oh, it would have been absolutely terrifying. I mean, I think we, like, as women, when we've sort of come to learn, especially over the years. Maybe it was different back in 1993 or in the 80s. Maybe it was a little bit safer, but these days there is absolutely no way as a woman you would walk around in the dark on your own.
no,
It just wouldn't happen.
No.
So, and I think a lot of those behaviours are informed by incidents and tragedies like these who are
definitely.
perpetrated by these absolute monsters.
Yeah.
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 So there's also, I mean, I read an article recently about the Ballarat lady who went
Mhm.
missing, and one of the articles that opinions that this article sort of was expressing was the fact that women used to be scared to leave the house at night on their own, and this was perpetrated during the day, during
Mhm.
daylight. Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Why is this? Are we ever safe?
Yeah.
Are men ever going to stop doing these things to women? But anyway,
Well, that's what so clearly links as well with Paul Denyer, because his first two murders were done at night.
Yep.
And so it was a thing of like, don't go out at night. But poor Natalie Russell, who left school at like 2:30 in the
2:30.
afternoon,
Yeah,
was unfortunately his third victim. He got so confident in what he was doing
and
that he did it
brazen.
in broad daylight.
Yep.
So it isn't a simple fact of just because it's dark, that you're safe, you're not safe. It was also during the day. So
Yeah, it's so tragic.
yeah, luckily he was caught after that, because clearly he would have continued to.
And you know what? Part of the reason he was caught was because it was during the day, and because somebody saw him doing something looking a bit suspicious during the day.
Yeah.
So ultimately, that was what got him. But again, we'll get to the details of that a little bit later on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It was really clear. I mean, well, as clear as we can see in hindsight, obviously. At the time, apparently they were talked about as a family all the time that he was dropped or fell off a bench top as a child and hit his head. And it was kind of this ongoing joke throughout the family of like that Paul did that because he was dropped on the head as a baby.
So it must have been, like, I feel like if that was the family story, it must have been a pretty significant knock to the head.
Yeah.
We know now more and more that
Mm,
concussions, especially in children and young people, are incredibly impactful.
yes.
So if he suffered a concussion at such a young age in a developing brain, who knows whether that had an impact or not. But
Well, you don't know what his personality was yet to know what the damage
yeah,
was.
and whether he had, like, whether anything changed before or after.
Yeah, and obviously it let me find my words. It definitely changes in terms of where the head injury was too. Like I think they believe it would have been a frontal lobe injury because that's what controls that impulse control, personality, those sorts of things are within that frontal lobe
Yes.
cortex of the brain. So there is thought that that was quite possibly what has created this monster,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And I'd be fascinated for them to be able to do like brain scans now and have
Oh, it would absolutely be fascinating. And then how much of it was just his nature to begin with anyway? And was it a combination of the two things that have just created this absolute monster? So when he was a child, he attacked their family cat
Mm,
and killed it. And I believe disemboweled it and hung it from the family tree, like a tree in the family's backyard.
yeah.
Um,
Denied it. Like they
Denied it.
couldn't prove that it was him, but I
Yeah.
mean, they reckon that I think his brother found his knife, which had blood on it,
And
and
cat hair on it, so they knew that
yeah,
he'd done it.
yeah.
But even before that, when he was about 10 years old, he was like torturing his sister's toys.
Oh
And so
yeah.
he was like practicing like slitting their throats and cutting off their heads
Mm.
and stuff like that. And you just think, oh,
I think
this,
he's a young boy too. I think he was maybe 11 or so, and he had an incident with a kid at school
yeah.
where he got so angry that he stabbed him down the throat with a pencil, and it only just missed his windpipe. Like the kid was very lucky to be alive.
Oh, very.
So I mean, there was obviously building
And
issues.
I think we can see that throughout. I think this is, his presentation is very typical of that of a serial killer if you look at it from a psychological standpoint.
Mm.
Not that either of us are psychologists, we're armchair detectives.
I wasn't that. We don't
Um,
need a degree.
but his escalating behavior was only going to lead one way.
Mm.
He's gone from hurting toys and inanimate objects to then hurting animals. He would also start fires, which is another red
Oh, I didn't know
flag.
that.
I just read something somewhere where he'd lit a few fires, nothing catastrophic,
Mm.
he'd done no major damage to anything, but
No.
I believe that's another red flag for, these sort
Yeah.
of
He was arrested for stealing vehicles, stealing cars in sort of 15.
yeah, 15.
Yeah. So I mean, he
Yeah.
was someone who would push the boundaries, legally, as well
Yeah.
already. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder whether some of that had whether that had anything to do with like his fascination or I don't know, his want to be seen by the police or
Mm.
his because when he was arrested, I know this is jumping quite far forward now, but when he was arrested, he and interviewed by the police, he actually could say to the police, "Oh, I saw you here," and like so he was
Really?
watching their behavior. I wonder whether him stealing a car at 15 was just a fascination of even
What would happen to me if I did
yeah, I
this?
wonder what would happen or would I
Yeah.
get caught? Could I watch? It's like he almost had a voyeurism like
Yes. Because didn't somebody, he knew that the cops were looking in the area or whatever because someone he knew had a scanner and he
oh,
was
that's right.
just connecting a few dots. So yeah,
Yes.
so he was obviously aware of like, and he wanted the cops to know that in his interview too, that like, I know what you know,
I
kind of,
know.
I'm
Yeah.
better than you. He had that very air
I've
about him of, I know how you do your job. Like I could do your job. Although he did apply for the police force and got
he
knocked back.
got rejected.
God,
That's right.
can you imagine? Yeah, so he clearly had that idea, that voyeurism of like not only women but also the police and how that worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
It's really,
That
really
was super
interesting.
creepy in the interview when he said that about I saw you and the other guy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing is when he was a child, he was obsessed with blood and gore movies. So
Mm,
that was something that, you know, even his entertainment was sort of down that path.
yeah.
Which I mean, there are a lot of people who are into blood and gore movies who aren't serial killers, but
Oh,
then it's an
definitely.
interesting. I just thought that was an interesting little factoid there.
Yeah, but it clearly didn't bother him seeing blood and things like that.
No, no.
Yeah. Mm.
So when he was growing up, he didn't really have, like, sort of when he was sort of coming out of teenagehood, he didn't have many prospects. He was looking for sort of little part-time jobs here and there, and he ended up working at a petrol station. And I think that was one of his first paid jobs growing up. And there's a story about where a neighbour of his, was the local petrol station. This was back in the day when the attendants would put the petrol in for you and you'd pay out through your window and sort of keep driving. And there was an incident that I think they interviewed the owner of the petrol station, and Paul had put petrol in this neighbour's car, knew her, as in they were neighbours, knew her to say hello to her. And then he was like, yep, you're good to go. And she drove off and the petrol bowser was still in her car.
Oh,
So in the end, no major damage again. But, what would possess somebody to do that? Did he know?
yeah.
The neighbour suspects he absolutely knew. And anyway, needless to say, he was
Catastrophic.
it could have been. It could have been.
He could have killed himself too.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know that, like, would he care?
yeah.
I don't know. But anyway, he was let go from that job,
Oh, maybe not the best fit then.
funnily enough.
Yeah.
Um,
He was let go from a number of jobs though, wasn't he?
he was. So the next job I think he had after that, and by this stage it's probably also worth mentioning that he had a girlfriend.
Yes.
And
interesting herself, very controlling even.
yeah.
Yeah.
But what kind of, not that she ever knew. There's no evidence to suggest she knew
no.
or had anything to do with any
No.
of the crimes that he perpetrated. But
Mm.
from all accounts, he was a fairly nondescript person. His personality.
He was just, just a nice guy, like the typical, I guess, that you get when a crime occurs, like, oh, but they seem so normal. Yeah, most
That's how
people
they
would say
fly.
that about him.
Yeah, and that's how they fly under the radar. Like, there was nothing sort of outstanding about him.
Yeah.
So anyway, he met his girlfriend working at Safeway at the Kringle shops, and they got together. She came from quite a religious family, I think, and I think her uncle, or I don't think it was her dad, I'm pretty sure it was her uncle, was the pastor or something of their local church,
Yeah.
and he didn't want them living together. And I think that really angered Paul. He didn't like that. He wanted
like that at all.
he wanted them to think that it was okay. It was like he needed approval from certain people.
Yeah. He seemed to have quite a religious background, and he seemed to enjoy church and what religion brought for him.
Yeah.
I know, really weird link for him.
Yeah, I find it strange too.
Yeah.
But when he was working at Safeway, there were a couple of incidents in the car park involving trolleys. So I think he was a bit of a trolley boy. He'd go around, pick up the trolleys out of the car park and bring them back into store. There were two incidents where he deliberately rammed the trolleys into women who had shopping in their cart, but one of them was particularly bad. He rammed the stack of trolleys into a lady, very heavily pregnant woman who had two young children in her cart, and rammed them so hard that the trolley tipped over. And I think at the end of the day, everyone ended up being okay, but they needed some medical attention. They went to the local GP.
Yeah.
But the second time the incident happened, this sort of more severe one, his boss saw it happen at the time and immediately terminated his employment again.
Yeah.
I think he'd only been working at Safeway for something like 6 months at the time. And I just think this is, another step in that escalation, in perpetrating violence against women.
It was clearly like going, what can I do to injure someone here, and how much pain would that cause, and kind of trying to work out the consequences of actions.
Yeah.
But without that impulse control of going, I'm not actually going to do it, or because that will hurt someone.
Yeah. I wonder whether his employer then reported that to the police or anything. I guess he's hurt people, so he's injured people, so there's a criminal element there.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't know.
In the 90s, without that, the understanding we have today of behaviours like that and where they escalate to, someone probably just was like, oh, he's just a silly young teenager, kind of thing, and fobbed it off a bit in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, you're probably right. we see things through such a different lens these days.
Mm.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Sometimes it
I
has
don't
become
remember.
a bit that's someone else's problem. I reckon back in
Yeah,
the 80s, 90s, like,
and I guess they did the right thing in getting medical attention for the kids and the mum, and everything was fine. So maybe they
yeah,
thought, oh, that's it, and he's
that's it.
terminated, and that's kind of the end of it. But the daughter who was in the cart was interviewed in a podcast I listened to, and she said it really shook her mum up,
Mm.
so much so that she never shopped at that shopping centre again.
Oh, yeah, even if you knew that he was not there, he
Yeah.
obviously had that sort of presence at the time. And I know when I've heard about that incident that she talks about his dark eyes, and that
Yes.
he just basically watched this take place from his standpoint and enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And
Didn't she comment like, even if he was trying to mask something, you think he'd be like, oh, sorry, oh, whoopsie.
yeah,
But no, there
mm,
was none of that.
no remorse, like, which is a theme for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Absolutely. So yeah, there was obviously, and then going on from that, prior to committing these murders, there was even more brazen acts that
Oh,
he did. So he broke into a number of houses, and women that he knew, like, and that he had befriended, sat and had coffee with and enjoyed times, and good, deeper, meaningful conversations with these people. He entered into one property and um, he destroyed all sorts of things in their house, and did it slowly. Apparently, he'd gone in quite a few
I
times.
think it was over 20 times they kind of
Put
figured
it
by the
into,
end of it.
because she kind of didn't. She had guests at the same time, so she kept putting things down to being, oh, that guest broke that and
And I
didn't
think,
tell me, or
yeah, I think
that
she was
was
a
the
nurse.
door.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think she was a nurse, so she was doing shift work and with people staying, and she thought, oh, it's a bit weird that,
yeah.
oh, they broke a cup and didn't tell me, or they left dirt on the floor and I didn't clean it up. That was strange.
Mm.
But she seemed like such
No,
a lovely,
the most
lovely, compassionate
soothing. Yeah,
person.
yeah,
And so she just sort of cleaned the things up and didn't think much of it.
yeah.
Um,
But then there was one particular entry that he went in, and he would he draw things? Oh, he put things on photos and like slit, like as if his throat was slit in photos,
yeah,
and stabbed, cushions, and
he
yeah,
carved something into her piano.
yes.
What was
What
it?
was it? It was let Jesus have sex with you.
Yeah.
Mm,
So even that's weird. I mean, she, again, we've heard an interview with her.
yeah,
If you listen to the Frankston Murders, Vicky Petratus' podcast, you'll hear that interview.
yeah.
And she's a religious woman herself. And her and Paul had conversations, a lot of conversations about religion. It seems like she was a little bit of a confidant to him, for him.
Absolutely.
And yet these are the things he's carving into her. Like it
Mm.
just seems really, really
It's
bizarre.
so unsettling thinking, I mean, she worked it out. It had to have been him. Not
Yeah.
that he was ever charged for it, or, that they put it together, but she assumed at the end of it that it had to have been
He
Paul.
he stabbed her. She was engaged to be married, and they'd had their engagement party, and he stabbed and like shredded her engagement dress. And didn't he cut up her underwear
Was
or
that
like
her?
like
Yeah.
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 So it's very, very
Yeah.
odd. But yeah, as you said, he was never charged with that crime.
No.
Um,
It was only after the fact that, like, when he was eventually convicted of
arrested.
the murders, that it was put together entirely. I think he admitted to doing it
He
in
did
his
in the
interviews, but she always thought it was him from the moment it happened. She was like, it only could have been. It was no one else it could have been, really, for her. So,
which makes me think like she must have had a vibe about him.
yeah. Yeah.
So you wouldn't just. So it was obviously they were neighbours, and so he'd come around for a coffee. But there must have been something about him that made her
Mm.
think that.
Yeah. But I think it was only after the fact that he then stopped coming around, which was then she put it together and kind of went,
Okay,
well, hang on a second, what's going on here?
that makes
Yeah, because
sense.
I think he even said to her, "Oh, that's terrible. That's happened. I'll look out for you, and keep an eye on things," which is so
What a
weird. Of that it's that control, I guess, as coming through in terms of that, oh, I'm the big powerful man and I'll take care of you now.
yeah,
But at the same time, I'm the one perpetrating this. Like,
yeah,
ugh, yeah.
it's horrible.
Mm,
Um, the next escalation, this one absolutely gets me.
ugh.
It just, oh, it gives me the absolute heebie-jeebies. So, another neighbour of his, her name was Donna Vanes. She had a young baby, I think maybe 3 months old or so. And her husband, I think as a second job, used to deliver pizzas at night. And on this particular night, he was doing a delivery and he went past the house and he's like, "Oh, I'll see if Donna wants to come for a drive," because apparently she didn't like to be idle. And so she'd already bathed the baby, fed the baby, and thought, "Oh, yeah, I'll come for a drive and finish the pizza run with you." Well, thank goodness she did, because when they got home from that delivery, which was only, I think, a few hours, not even,
less
it was less than a couple of hours, I
yeah.
think. Her husband walked in the house and he told her, he's like, "Don't come in here. You know,
I
it's
think he got hit
horrible,
by the
horrible."
smell at
Yeah.
first too. Yeah.
And they walked in and there was blood everywhere. And their cat had recently had kittens, and the cat had been disemboweled, which I can imagine the smell would be absolutely
God.
horrific. And he'd slit the throat of all the kittens. And then he'd written on the wall in the cat's blood, "Donna, you're dead."
Yeah.
So, and later on when he was interviewed, he actually said, "Yeah, if she was home, I would have killed her."
Yeah.
Just that
Yeah.
matter of fact.
Oh, yeah, and because he'd actually stabbed the cot where the baby would sleep, obviously, as well. So I don't think he would have hesitated if they were home. It would have been Donna and her baby would have been murdered. Yeah.
And I think similarly to his other neighbour, he, I think, stabbed photos and also, again, with the underwear.
Well, didn't he leave pornographic photos
And
on the cat?
yes.
Like, what the? Yeah.
So
Which
bizarre.
that really gets me. I don't understand that. I can't get my head around that, and the fact that there was no sexual assault then at any point in his, none of this actually goes as far as sexual assault in terms of even the murders. He captures these women and has them under his control. He never sexually abused them before murdering them or after, whatever, if that's your thing. But yeah, so but to leave these pornographic photos, like, it sort of, I don't know, that never escalated, thank God, I guess. I don't know, unless there's something we don't know, but
I mean, the other thing is maybe there was a sexual element to it that didn't involve rape. I don't
true.
know. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't think we know. I don't think
No.
that's ever been discovered or discussed. I'm not sure.
No, it's just this hatred for women is really all you can get at, but
Yeah.
that didn't seem to equate to sexual assault, so
Thankfully. I mean, if there's some small mercy in all of this, I guess that's something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Donna and her family never moved back into that house, as you wouldn't. It'd just be absolutely terrifying. And you've got a little baby, a vulnerable little baby. And apparently she was so traumatized by the whole thing that she wouldn't even not living in that house. I think they moved in with her sister for a little while. She wouldn't even go to the toilet alone. She couldn't be alone.
It's horrendous. I mean, and again, she knew it was Paul, but he was never arrested for that.
Yep.
So, I mean, and you sort of wonder that each of these little moments, these women sort of basically were like, I think it's Paul, because I think it was the same block of units
Yes,
where they all lived. And I think to be able to then kind of go that two women are going, this guy broke into my house and did some pretty horrendous shit. What, the cops didn't get him for those at all. I wonder if he had gone to jail for those acts.
I think he would have been out and he would have just perpetrated something at some point anyway.
True.
And this is part of the reason why he should never, ever get out, because somebody, with this kind of psychopathy, he's never going to change.
No.
And he would have just gotten out, and I don't think it would have mattered to him that he'd been in prison. That wouldn't have deterred him from committing any further crimes. It might not have been the same, or probably wouldn't have been the same people, but I just feel like had he been convicted and imprisoned for these two, I guess, lesser crimes in some ways, I don't think it would have changed the course of what was going to happen eventually anyway.
It's so true. Yeah. I mean, it's that whole idea of innocent till proven guilty. You can't get him in jail for life until he does the heinous act that puts him there. So no matter what, it's almost like he had to murder.
Yeah.
And these women had to die.
Yeah.
For other women to survive. It's that.
I wonder whether these days it would be different, because I'm sure they, Donna's house was fingerprinted and all of that kind of stuff. Would that have gone further these days? Like, we're 30 years down the, or 31, whatever years down the track.
Police are far more trained these days in terms of, animal cruelty, is a red flag of someone who will eventually, potentially do other crimes.
Yeah.
So I wonder then, if there would have been intervention of other kinds. Not that he can't be fixed if, he was diagnosed, I believe, eventually with sadistic, psychotic behaviours and things. It was, or sadistic personality disorder was what he was diagnosed with. It's not in the DSM-5; it was in the DSM-3, I think. Yeah, but now, but he would still be diagnosed these days with something similar, within a personality disorder,
Sure.
they can't be treated. So, not that being an intervention of having a psychologist involved earlier on would have changed him, but maybe he would have been more under a radar.
Yeah,
that then he wouldn't have been able to do these acts.
Yeah.
Especially 3.
Exactly. So Denya's first victim was Elizabeth Stevens. She was 18 years old when this crime was perpetrated against her, and it just is, absolutely horrible to think that an 18-year-old with the world ahead of her. I mean, remember what we were all like at 18. You've got so many hopes and dreams and aspirations, and I think that was very true of Elizabeth Stevens. She'd moved here from Tasmania to Victoria to live with her auntie and uncle. I think she had aspirations of going into the army.
Yeah.
And
shock of her childhood herself,
Yeah.
other forms of things, and she was literally finding her feet in Melbourne, and with her auntie and uncle, and found they were so caring of her. They were so excited to have her living with them, which is rare that that someone can jump from their biological family home with mum, dad, or situation, and that didn't work out so well, to then be sort of thrown around a bit, but then find this loving family that were very willing to take her in.
Yeah. And she just sounded like such a conscientious young woman. She was studying her HSC at TAFE because in order to get into the army, you needed your HSC at the time. And so I think on the day in question, she had been studying at Frankston Library. Is that Frankston Library. I think her auntie and uncle lived in Langwarrin, didn't they?
Yeah, which are like side by side suburbs, basically.
Yeah. She had left a note back in the days before mobile phones and not being able to track everyone where they are at any time of the day.
Yeah.
She had left a note for her auntie and uncle, and one of the police officers who originally attended the house of the auntie and uncle when she went missing made a comment that he knew right away that this wasn't a runaway. He knew for the fact that she'd written such a detailed note to her auntie and uncle. He thought, no, there's no way this girl's just gone walkabout and run away or done something.
Yeah, that note had intention. It was,
apparently it was so specific. She was like, I'm going to catch this bus and it arrives at this time and I'll be home by this time. And when she didn't show up at home, her auntie and uncle did get concerned straight away, didn't they?
Yeah.
And they went out looking for her. I think her uncle went out looking and her auntie stayed at home to see if she showed up. And when she didn't, I think she was saying she was going to be home by 8 p.m. And when she didn't arrive home, they went out looking, and I think by about 10 p.m. that night, they reported her missing to the local police.
Yeah, which other 18-year-olds you might think of, they've gone to a friend's house, they've gone out, wouldn't be overly concerned if they weren't home at 10 p.m. But Elizabeth was clearly someone who was, one-track mind of, I'm doing this HSC, I've got a plan, I'll be home, I want to make my auntie and uncle know that I'm trustworthy, did all the right things. And, meant that by 10 p.m. they were very concerned where she was. The weather was horrendous that night too, which Paul obviously used to his advantage. There was absolutely bucketing rain, and I think it was the wind was horrendous too.
Yeah.
So, which meant that when we did grab her off of the bus that she came off of, there was no one really around to look, because everyone, head down trying to run to a car or run for cover, that didn't notice what went on and couldn't hear.
And there's also less people around when it's raining. You're not going out for a walk at night. You're not doing anything because it was not just raining. It was, as you said, it was absolutely bucketing down. Denya's used that to perpetrate his first murder.
Yeah.
So she ended up being murdered in a park. It was about 250 metres from her auntie and uncle's front door, from
Oh,
her home.
oh, I didn't
Um,
believe it was that close.
yeah, it was
That's
so close. She was found the next morning. I think it was by somebody. Was he gathering?
he was looking for a Christmas tree for
Yeah,
Christmas in July.
I was going to say pine cones, but I think it was like a pine tree or something.
Yeah, trying to get a branch or a bit of a small tree to yeah, he wanted to chop a branch off to have a Christmas in July party at home. Back in the 90s, they were a pretty big deal. And so he was looking for that, and he happened to stumble across her body, which he had barely like hidden. He had just put a branch over her. He wasn't really trying to hide the body by any means. It wasn't that he wanted that found.
Yes.
It was not, yeah, it wasn't hidden really. So unfortunately for that guy to walk along and find that, it would have been very traumatic.
Incredibly traumatic. And
Yeah.
again, being that it was in the days before mobile phones, he had to leave her there.
Yeah.
And which, I mean, that would be hard enough in and of itself. I think I don't know how that would feel to then have to go home,
Yeah.
phone the police, and then obviously go back to the scene. And
Yeah.
I think the police got there around, very, very quickly.
Yes.
And
Well, obviously they were aware there was a young girl missing, so connecting the dots and hoping that this wasn't her, obviously. But
yeah,
it was.
I heard an interview with her uncle, and he said that the police had sort of mentioned, or it might have even been on the news, that a body of a young woman was found, and they were just in complete denial that it could possibly be her. So the post mortem for Elizabeth revealed petechial hemorrhages, which indicates strangulation. So that was the cause of death.
Yeah.
She was also stabbed, and she was found with her shirt up above her chest, above her breasts. And I guess initially the detectives investigating were wondering whether or not there was a sexual element to this crime. I think we mentioned earlier in the episode that that's never been proven. I think there are people who think there may have been a sexual motivation in some respect, but the shirt being up around her chest has been put down to the fact that he actually dragged her by her feet to where her final resting place ended up being, and that has sort of caused her shirt to kind of roll up.
Yeah, it wasn't him lifting it up and doing
No,
anything that, yeah.
and there was no evidence of rape or
No.
any kind
There
of.
were some interesting cut marks to her chest, I believe, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that true of all of his victims or just
No, it seemed to be
Elizabeth?
just Elizabeth,
think
from what I
so.
can gather. I couldn't find any evidence that it was a consistent pattern, because that was the other thing with each one. It was different.
Do you think that was an opportunistic thing? Like, as he dragged her shirt's come up and he's like
gone to stab her
stabbed
too.
there.
It felt like it was something you could do.
I
Yeah,
don't
possibly. I
know.
don't know if
Was
it was
it just
before or after, or whether it was in the struggle. Because I mean, from all accounts, all three women, or all four, including Rosa Toff, who survived, all fought very hard.
Yes.
And so I think that, probably just in the moments, maybe that's just different stab marks from controlling the situation. Yeah, I don't know that it was necessarily purpose to it.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there is evidence of post-mortem stab wounds
Yep.
as well. It wasn't just, and as I said, like her actual cause of death was strangulation, not she didn't die from the stab wounds. But
yeah, I mean, the poor girl, she went through absolute hell because she did fight and she didn't die as quickly as he would have liked her to, I don't think. There was some horrendous evidence to suggest that he even admitted it in the interview that he thought she was dead, but then she got back up
to her feet.
Yes.
Can you even imagine what that would have taken?
to her, like she was going to fight to get away. Which I mean, poor girl, my heart goes out to her to go through that. So then he knew he had her and had the control over her at that point, and knew that she wasn't going to manage to get away. But it didn't matter for her; she was going to keep trying. But yeah, so then he eventually, I think he stood on her head, and that ended it for her, which is just horrific. Can't even.
No, it's just absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
So his next victim was Deborah Freeman.
Yeah.
Deborah was mum of a 12-day-old baby. His name's Jake.
And again, absolutely loving life. She was
Yeah.
in her element. All she wanted was to be a mum, and, and she was confidently staying with this baby. That it wasn't, I think the first go-to for a new mum who goes missing, the thought process of, is this a mum who just isn't coping with an incredibly difficult situation of a newborn baby? Has she just gone for I need some time to myself kind of stuff, or postnatal depression,
Mhm.
something like that? But everyone was adamant at the time, that's not Deborah. That's not what's gone on here. They knew, her family and friends knew that immediately, because she was so confident as a new mum.
I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning she was only 22 years
Oh,
old,
so
so you can understand why people may think, God, it's very overwhelming. You and I, we've all been there,
well,
and it is a really overwhelming time, especially for that first baby, and you're learning. But by all accounts from all of her friends, she was absolutely thriving as a mum. There are some photos that if you just search her up, of her bathing Jake. There's a photo of her just holding him, and it's beautiful. You can tell she's just glowing. She looks amazing, and she's so happy. Her partner said the same. She was just delighted, delighted in being a mum, and so happy. So much so, and this really sort of surprised me, because I feel like when my eldest was 12 days old, I barely knew which way was up.
yeah.
Um, and yet on the day, Deborah had been out with a friend for the day, so she'd taken her new baby out and about,
Yeah.
and
Who
then
does
she was,
that? I'm like
I
locked
know,
down.
I know. I think,
Can't
I
leave
mean,
the house. What if it needs to be fed?
yeah, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Um, and then she had a friend coming for dinner that night, and he'd never met the baby before. Her partner was on night shift, so I think he was working, I think it was 2 till 10 or something like that. Her partner worked with her brother, and so they were at work together, and their friend came over to meet the baby, and she was cooking, I think it was an omelette for dinner, and she had some veggies on the stove, and she realized she didn't have any milk. And the milk bar was a couple of 100 meters up the road, but she decided to hop in her car and quickly go up and get some milk. She knew she'd be so quick that she actually left the veggies on the stove still cooking, and left her friend with the baby, because the baby was sleeping, I believe, at the time. So thought it'd be no big deal to quickly run up to the shops. You are way more over the way she ended up
Yeah. So her car was parked on the
orienting the
opposite
car.
side of the road to the actual milk bar. So literally she pulled up, hopped out of her car, and so went across the road into the milk bar, which meant that to get home again, she needed to do a U-turn on the road and chuck a Yui, and reverse to go back home. Which again, as you said, I think it was less than 600 meters down. It was literally at the end of her street was the milk bar sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It was
I think you
very
could
close.
see the milk bar if you went to the bottom of her driveway.
Yeah.
You could see the milk bar down the road.
But there was originally a bit of mix-up in terms of where she'd gone to get the milk,
Yeah.
where they were like adamant, all the family, like it would have been that milk bar. But apparently the guy who owned the shop was a bit, oh, I don't know if I saw her. No, I didn't see her. Oh, yes, I definitely saw her. So, whereas I think, and there was actually, should have been, there was evidence there to prove that it was that milk bar eventually once they caught Baldania for doing this, because he took them back to the scene and explained exactly what he did.
Yes.
Which makes me. I literally like the other night when I was at your place, it was dark. I got back to my car. I checked my back seat before I got in my car, and I do now after listening to all of this more recently, because what Paul Denny did was as she jumped out of the car and ran into the milk bar, which crime of opportunity, he must have literally just been, well, he had actually done some stuff prior to this. He was walking home and went, oh, perfect, I'll grab this one, because he jumped into the back seat or back of the car, because she left her car unlocked. She was running in to grab milk. She was going to be 1 minute literally running in there to grab the milk. As she was in the milk bar, he's climbed into the back seat of her car. She's come back from the milk bar, put her stuff down on the passenger seat. She's gone to drive off to do that U-turn. As she's gone to do the U-turn, he has grabbed her from behind around the neck. So as anyone would, you'd freak out. She actually crashed her car into a wall, into the right next to the milk bar, into the building there. She lost control of the car and has hit the wall. She wouldn't have been doing big speeds, but still hit the wall, to which he has then had to direct her, like reverse it, pull it out of this and then drive off. But how absolutely horrible. He's then driven her to a spot where where he's unfortunately murdered her. But he drove the car part way home himself
Yep.
and left it there for the cops to find the following day. But
Yeah.
yeah, horrendous to have that happen. Jump in the
Yeah.
car and bang.
And
Yeah.
imagine being the friend who was at home. Like, he was watching Home and Away.
Yep.
As you do in the 90s. And it sort of dawned on him at the end of the episode that he was like, oh, she's not back yet. And he turned the veggies off and walked to the end of the driveway to see if he could see her coming, and couldn't, and went back inside and waited for a little bit and decided to ring her partner at work. And immediately her partner was worried. Her partner rang the lady she'd been with, the friend that she'd been with during the day, and the friend ended up coming over to the house to look after baby Jake so that her partner and the friend who'd gone there for dinner could go out searching for her. And eventually, I think once her brother finished work, he sort of joined in that search. But again, by the end of that night, they knew they had to report it to the police because it was just so out of character, and there was no way that she'd do anything like this.
Yeah. The cops weren't overly convinced that it was, nothing more than, as we said, a mother who needed some time out and taken herself off. But as soon as they found the car the next day, they knew that there was foul play.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that made them sort of convinced pretty immediately is the fact that the seat was pushed all the way back, and apparently she was quite short. And so they knew someone else had driven the car.
Yeah.
He'd gone back the next day, I think, to get the groceries out of the car
before
too.
They found the car, the cops, he wandered back. He wanted to know who it was, what her name was. So he went back to find her purse. He took the groceries too.
Oh.
Yeah.
The milk would be a bit gross by the next day, but anyway.
Well, too bad for him.
Yeah. Let's hope he got a bit of food poisoning.
Yes. So he wanted to know who she was. So he ended up taking her purse and things. He buried them as well, a bit not far from where her body was.
And
so it was very much in the area the day.
Yeah, he loved watching people walking around and, suspecting things.
Yeah.
I think it was 4 days until her body was found, so it was actually a little bit longer. And the reason for that is where he dumped her body was actually apparently backing onto a paddock.
Yep.
And a farmer found her body because he actually said he'd just finished watching the news.
Yeah.
And there was a news story about this missing mum, and it had a photo of her, up on the news story. And he'd gone out to, tend to his cows, and the cows were milling around a certain area. And he thought, oh, that's a bit strange. Why are they over near the fence? And he actually thought the fence had been broken and they were trying to get out.
Yeah.
But by the time he got over there on his little four-wheeler, he realised as he got over there that there was a deceased body there. Well, at first he thought it was a mannequin, yeah. And then the closer he got, and then he said once he saw her face, he said, he'd just seen her face, on the news, and so he knew straight away. And again, had to go all the way back to the house to phone the police. So she was lying there for 4 days.
Absolutely sucks.
Horrible. Yeah. And imagine what that 4 days would have been like for her family and friends.
Horrendous.
Just horrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth mentioning as well that this crime was perpetrated on the same day, I believe, that Rosa Toth was attacked. Yeah. So Rosa, again, my God, what a fight this woman put up. Yeah. He tried to snatch her into a toilet block, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And he had a fake gun that he put to her head to try and control her, but she managed to break free.
She apparently knew it was fake because she could feel that it wasn't made of metal.
Mm-hmm.
So she was gutsy enough to go, nah, I'm going to call you bluff.
Call you on that, yeah.
Yeah. She's a legend.
What an absolute legend.
Yeah.
But again, it didn't all get put together until after he was arrested, really, that crime was actually perpetrated by him as well.
Yeah.
So I think on that day he obviously had the urge, tried with Rosa, she escaped, and then he's just by absolute bad luck.
Yeah. Literally, I think he was walking home after being,
that's right,
ousted by Rosa Toth and not getting what he wanted, but he had that, as in his words, that go voice in his head
Yep.
from his confessions that he was going to kill that night, and happened to then stumble across poor Debbie Frame getting in her car, or getting out of her car at that milk bar that night.
Yeah.
And it was like, right, I've got another victim here.
That's it.
Just horrendous.
So her cause of death was the same. She was strangled. Her clothes had all been slashed, and her throat was cut.
Yeah.
So
there was definitely definite escalations in his approach with each one. So he
got more violent.
More violent, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, this one happened under the, I guess, perceived cover of darkness. But his next victim, Natalie Russell, who was a schoolgirl, I think she was 17 years old, is that right?
Yeah. Studying year 12.
Yeah, year 12.
Local high school.
Yeah, she was walking home from school at 2:30 in the afternoon. And I mean, by this stage, everyone in Frankston and the surrounds were on high alert.
They had pretty much put together that this was a serial killer. This is one person who's perpetrated both these murders. There was also 2 other murders that had occurred earlier in the 90s that they were linking in some way at that point, going, could this all be linked? Obviously still questions over that. So they were considering this to be a serial killer already. So the public were on high alert.
They were.
Yeah.
And so I think, so I believe where Natalie's school was, a lot of kids, during that time would walk through. There was a pathway. There were 2 golf courses, and there's a pathway in between the 2 golf courses. And a lot of kids had used that to kind of cut through and get into either where they lived or whatever they were doing. And the school had recommended that they don't use that path because it was fairly secluded, and unless there were, golfers around, it wasn't a well-populated area. But on this particular day, and probably because it was 2:30 in the afternoon,
both of these other murders had been, been at night. She didn't have any reason to necessarily think.
Not at all.
You always think it's not me, it's someone else, don't you? I mean,
of course you do. I mean, the thought, you can't even imagine that this would happen to you.
No.
So Natalie decided to go down the path, and it was a much quicker way for her to walk home, I believe. It basically was straight through, and it was into the estate where she lived. And this one was a little bit more premeditated in that Denya had cut a hole in some cyclone fencing, or in a wire fence, and so that he could sort of lay in wait and wait for his next victim to stroll on past and capture her. When he was arrested and he did a walkthrough of this scene, I don't know if you've seen this footage, but it is absolutely chilling because he shows how, and he thinks he's so frigging clever.
So he thinks he's so much smarter than the cops.
Oh my God.
He thought that they'd be like, oh wow,
yeah,
how smart are you for doing that?
Yeah, and he's like, I was able to walk silently behind her. And he even shows how he does that.
Like he's grass rather than on the footpath. Dickhead.
You're a piece of shit.
Absolutely.
So he grabbed her, dragged her through the cyclone fencing, and murdered her there. She was found the next day. They identified her because her backpack was still with her that had all of her school books with her name in them. She was still dressed in her school uniform. Her mum, oh my goodness.
It wasn't her that whole night waiting, because they couldn't see anything down there. Like they could at night, they almost had to wait for the light of day to be able to get access, because they didn't want to move anything for crime scene preservation until they could actually see what was going on there. So they pretty much had to wait hours to really get information. But her mum was adamant it wasn't her because she was too strong to do that. No one would be able to get Natalie. It was break your heart.
And she really was a strong girl, because it is thanks to her fight that they were able to prove that Denya was the perpetrator of the crime. She had lifted some skin off him, like a tiny piece. She's obviously been fighting to...
Yeah, under her fingernails was all...
Yeah, and I believe
evidence, and
that's it. And there was
he had actually sliced his own finger as well around her neck. He'd actually taken a small piece off of his middle finger, which ended up on her body. They found within like a mark within her neck, I think it was.
Oh, I thought it was on her jumper, but you're probably right. But it's just horrific. Absolutely horrific what this poor 17-year-old girl had to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. So luckily for her, for the rest of the community, I guess this the postie that was working in the area had spotted a car sitting on the side of the road at the end of this track, and seen that this guy looked pretty suspicious, slouching down in the car, as people were walking past and things. So she took it upon herself to sort of go, no, this isn't right. I'm going to contact the police. So she went to a neighbour and knocked on the door and asked to use the phone to call the police. So she did that. And so there were police actually checking out the vehicle at the time of the murder taking place down the track.
It's
I mean,
chilling.
they weren't to know at the time, but at least then they had record of the vehicle and obviously then the registered owner of that vehicle.
Yeah.
So immediately the following day when they were able to identify that it was Natalie on the track that had been murdered, they linked it up with this car that had been spotted there and looked up the registration to find it was registered to none other than Paul Denyer. Yeah. Winner.
Another thing I find extremely chilling about this is in his confessional when he was talking to the police after he murdered Natalie Russell, he went home and had a roast dinner.
Oh, yeah.
As you do.
As you do.
Like, I
How
just
could you
think
do that? Just sit and have regular conversation with your girlfriend and her mum, wasn't it? Like,
Yep.
just another
another night.
Absolutely gets me. No. But even throughout his whole confession or the whole interview with the police, because he thinks he sort of has it over them I think it took 7 hours before he went,
yeah, right, fine. Yeah.
I mean, that's a long time to be sitting in a room kind of chatting away. I mean, you as much as you would be exhausted as the interviewer, he's got to be exhausted at that point,
For sure. I actually just put another thing together, just thinking about that.
Yeah.
So they'd actually suspended the interview for a moment, and he was being looked after by a detective, I think, who hadn't been interviewing him. And he saw that this detective had a cross around his neck and that he used that to connect with him. So that brings it back to that religious aspect and what that played in his life. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then they were like, well, we better sort of get this interview back on track. And then he
panicked actually.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, quicker. As you would. Quick, get the recording going. And yeah,
they would have got they would have got him anyway, but he realised that at that point. But the thing was that the cop put it to him, like, each of the murders. He was very brazen in that he was like, he admitted he was in the area for each of these murders. I just happened to be doing this at that point, and I was there for that reason, and I was there for that one. But yeah, it wasn't me that did it. But the cop really laid it out for him and went, is this just a coincidence, mate, that you were here for this and here for that? And then there's this pause in the interview, and it lasts for a good 20 seconds.
Yep.
And if you watch the actual footage of it, it's chilling. The way the cop does it so well. He waits for him to put it together to go, we've got you, mate. And Paul just sits there and holds that time. He just holds it.
Unnerving to watch.
Really is. It just got me. And because then the cop then breaks that silence to sort of say, do you really think this is just a coincidence? Like, do you think you want to admit something to this? To which Paul Denyer just answers, no.
Yeah.
And they have to keep going for, however many hours after that, still before.
It was many hours after.
I think it was the DNA that he realised in the end. Once they sort of.
It was conclusive evidence.
Yeah.
When he did admit it and they asked him why.
Yeah.
And what he actually said was, they said, can you explain why we have only women victims? And he said, I just hate them.
Yeah.
Is it worth getting into the Paula Denyer side of things? I think we need to at least mention it.
Acknowledge that fact.
Yeah, so when he was in prison, he decided that he wanted to transition and he wanted to be called Paula. He grew his hair. Apparently he was making makeup out of like dirt and crushing different things to make pigment to wear lipstick and blush. And he grew his hair into like little pigtails, and he wanted gender affirming surgery.
Well, having said that, he did ask for it, and he did ask for makeup and things like that. And look, all respect to any transgender people. If that's how you feel, I respect that 100%.
For sure.
But clearly, in his situation, he wasn't genuine because there's one thing that the cop, the police said no. In the prison, they said no to him to those things, which they would probably say no to anyone at first because they're in prison. Like they want to test this limit, but apparently, due to human rights,
Yeah, there is.
they actually can't say no if it genuinely is requested and genuinely wanted. But eventually, if he had pushed it, they would have said yes.
Yeah.
They have to say yes.
So,
but they didn't. So they never did. And he never pushed it.
No, I've got two opinions on this. My first thing is, did he do that because he wanted to access a women's prison and perpetrate further violences against women? Or did he perpetrate against women because he hated the fact that he was potentially transgender?
I go with
the first one.
A.
Yes, same.
Because if it was genuinely B, I think he would. This was
you wouldn't let it go.
To persist with it and continue.
Yeah, you wouldn't let it go. If you truly felt that you wanted to transition, that you were a woman, you could not you could not let that go.
No.
You couldn't live anymore, especially now that, he'd sort of made that confession or however you want to call it.
He's very much steered in completely the other direction. He hasn't even gone a little bit, like, oh, look, I still want that, but, I don't deserve it, or, like, there's none of that. It's now he is very adamantly, he's he and him now, that there is pronouns. He's cut his hair now. He's not having the long hair. He doesn't do the makeup thing anymore.
No.
So I think he's got no attachment to it. There's not that genuine stake in that.
I agree. I feel like it was just a manipulation of the system. He tried to, again, thinking he's probably smarter than everyone else who's there.
Exactly. I really do. I think that's ultimately what his goal was to, he wanted access.
Yeah.
Yeah, because from all accounts, the prison guards the males he gets along with quite well, and they don't seem to have any issue with him. But any females within the prison system would tell you how he is quite horrific to deal with. They talk about his dark eyes, comes up a lot when they're speaking to him, whereas the men don't see it.
It's interesting that
he doesn't behave that way to them.
It's interesting that the dark eyes are a theme right from when he was pushing trolleys into people when he was a late teenager or early 20s, however old he was then, to now being in prison as a 50-odd-year-old man and having that same comment made about him. It just,
speaks to that. I think that he would definitely offend again. That side of him is still in there.
And he keeps some really great company in prison, doesn't he?
Oh, he does. He's got some great mates. Robert Lowe has been a pretty close mate of his in prison, along with Mr. Stinky.
Winning combo.
Yep. Yeah, so I think that he clearly mingles with people who have similar...
what do they say? Like attracts like?
Yeah, exactly. It's that, they have control over their victims. They like to feel that control over someone. So, Mr. Stinky, particularly with children, but that's the thing, pedophiles is who he's gravitated towards as being his best mates in prison. So, they can enjoy each other's company all their life.
Rot all together in there.
So thankfully you will be there for life now.
That's right. So he was due for parole, but he will actually now never, ever see life outside of prison again, thankfully.
Yeah, so he was originally given a life sentence for 3 life sentences plus 8 years for abduction of Rosa.
Yep.
But that was overturned by an appeal originally that gave him, he had to apparently have a parole set. So that was I think 1994-ish.
I think it was the following year, 1994, and it was revised to a 30-year term.
30-year term, or 30-year minimum. Came to 2023, he was eligible for parole, and obviously he put in for that, but thankfully I believe the laws have changed as well with that, and he will adamantly be in there for the rest of his life, thank God.
I mean, I guess it's known as well that people like Denya don't change. There is a very, very high chance that should he be released into society, that he would actually more than likely perpetrate further crimes. So he is where he needs to be. Definitely. And may he rot furthermore.
Oh, God, yeah. Yes. What an absolute piece of shit.
Total piece of shit. So I think that kind of wraps up our first episode, Meg. How do you think we did?
Oh, I think we can do better next time,
Yeah.
always. But I think I had fun. It was a good chat.
It was fantastic. So our next episode is going to be about JonBenet Ramsey, and I don't know about you, but I'm deep into the research on this one, and I think it's going to be a really great episode.
Really looking forward to hashing some of that out with you because
There's so many theories and there's so much information out there, so that'll be a good one.
I think quite different to this one in a lot of ways too, so we can really
for sure
expand on where we're going with this, which is great.
That's it. So thank you everybody for listening, and we hope that you can tune in for the next one.
Yeah, start listening to some JonBenet before you come join us next week for sure. Yeah.
See you later, everyone.
Bye.